Hi, this is Greg Perkins. In this video, I'm going to show you how to configure your Leica Captivate software for base rover operation using a GNSS receiver. This is Captivate version 7 that I'm showing you, and I'm using a Leica GS18I for both my base and my rover operation. The first thing I recommend that you do is to create a working style. I prefer to use working styles to manage my different RTK operations, my static survey operations, or work with a robotic or manual total station. So in this case, what I'm going to do is go to Settings, I'll go to Customization, and then Working Style Wizard. Show you here that I have a base rover working style created. I'm going to assume that you know how to do a working style and set that all up. But again, the reason we do that is so that we can attach an RTK profile to this. So let me show you how to create an RTK profile. I'm going to go to Connections, RTK Rover Wizard. I'm already connected to my GS18, so I'm going to say create a new profile. I'll give it a name. You want to make this identifiable, so I'll say base rover, and I'll call this short. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm going to use the internal radio on the GS18. If you have a high power base radio that you want to use with that, you might want to use a different naming style. So I'll go ahead into my description and say internal, and I'll press next. On the connection screen, you want to set radio, press next, and then select GS radio, which will set the internal radio for the device, and press next. I've already programmed this radio with different frequencies. So here's one note. You're going to need to connect both your base antenna and your rover antenna as rovers to your controller first and program the frequencies. In just a second, I'll show you how to program those frequencies, but you should know that you can't do the frequency programming in the RTK base mode for your receiver. On this screen, the important thing, once you select your channel, is to select your modulation type. Modulation type needs to match on both base and rover. I would refer you to the manuals for your internal Satel radios as what the best type of modulation type would be for the area that you're working. I typically use either Satel 8 or Satel 16 FSK. Once we have that set, we can press next. You're going to set your RTK data format. If you have a receiver that is tracking GPS, GLONASS, Galileo, and Baidu constellations, you want to set your RTK data format to RTCM v3. If you have Leica receivers at both the base and the rover, you want to set the sensor at base and antenna at base to automatically detect. And then I would make sure that the receive RTK network information here at the bottom is not checked, that auto coordinate system is not checked. One note about RTK base has a unique ID. If you're working on a site with multiple RTK base stations, that could be a construction site with machine control operations going on, or in the location where another surveyor might be using an RTK base radio, you might want to specify that your RTK base has a unique ID. And I'll show you how to set this when we go to the RTK base side of this situation. In this case, let's say our RTK base ID is going to be number 1, and then we'll press next. And what that does is allows you to isolate your base rover setup from other broadcasts that might be going on site. So I'll press next. The RTK profile is looking for a base station sensor. To complete the process, I don't have the base up and running yet, so we'll just go ahead and press next, and that will finish the wizard. So what we need to do now is show you how to program a frequency into your GPS antenna. So we'll go to Settings, Connections, All Other Connections, and then we'll select GS Connections, and we'll press Control. From here, we would press Function and then Settings, and that will take us to our channel list. To create a new channel, we would press New, put in the next available number on the channel, select your spacing, and then we'll program in our frequency. So in this case, we'll say 462.50, and we'll press OK. One caveat on this, if you do have a high-powered base station, you will need an FCC license to operate that. And then also, I would recommend that you use your licensed frequencies. Check with your dealer or the person you bought your RTK radio from for more information on that. So once you have the channel set, you press Store, and we're now on a screen here. Then we can select a channel. In this case, I want to switch to channel 1, so I'll press Enter. The channel updates, and I'll press OK. One other thing that we can do, if we're here in the main menu and we want to change the channel on our rover, we can select the radio here at the top and press change channel, and that brings us back to the same page. So now we're ready to set up our base station. So I'll say switch to base.
Connection to GS sensor lost.
So as noted earlier, you need to program the frequencies into your base station antenna using the rover mode that we were just in. But we're now in the base station mode, and what we need to do is set up a few more settings to get this unit up and running as an RTK base station. So what we'll do is we'll go to settings, go to connections, and then we'll go to all other connections. You have the option to run two RTK based devices at the same time. So you could have an external radio attached to your GPS antenna. You could also use the internal. In this case, we're going to just use the internal radio on our base station. So I'm going to select RTK base 1. You could use either RTK base 1 or base 2. And I'll press edit. And I want to transmit RTK data. And I want to connect using the GS radio. You notice I have a device here called base. If I press device, you'll notice that I have a device here called Satel TR4 Plus. That is the name of the internal radio in the Leica GS18. If you're using the same collector for both the base and the rover, you will need to create a second device here, and I typically just call this base, and you do that by selecting Satel TR4 and press new. Let me just do that for you. I'll give it a name. We'll call it base 1 in this case, and press store. The reason you do that is if you try to use the same Satel device, because you're using the same controller, you will get a conflict. So this just makes it easier. So just create a new device, select it, press OK, and then you want to select your RTK data format. Again, we have 4 constellations that we're tracking on our receiver, and to broadcast information from all 4 of those constellations, we want to make sure that our RTK data format is set to RTCM V3 MSM. You don't need to apply antenna corrections to your RTK data stream. One thing we do need to do is we need to, since we told on our rover that our base was using a unique ID, we need to set that same ID on our base station. You do that by selecting the data rate button here, scrolling down to the bottom, select the field that says RTK base ID. On the rover we set 1, so we'll set 1 here and press OK. And then the last thing we need to do is set our channel and our modulation type. So we do that by selecting control, and we make sure that the channel matches here with what was on our rover, that our modulation type is the same, but we used 8 FSK on our rover. If everything's correct here, then we are ready to start our receiver broadcasting. So we'll press OK, press OK. A couple of other items here. If you want to record raw data on your base station as you're broadcasting RTK corrections, you would do that by going to settings, GS base, raw data logging. You can log raw data to the GS sensor. You can set the time interval that you want. We can do 1 second, 5 seconds. Let's do 5 seconds here. And then we can, if you have it enabled, you can either log in the native Leica format or you can log data in Rhinex format. A couple of things you should know here. The GS18s now have access to use internal memory on the receiver, so you can store your raw data either to the SD card in the receiver or to the internal memory. If you do store to the internal memory, you will need a cable to download that information to your computer after you're finished with your session. So we're going to log our data to the GS sensor. We'll press OK, and now we're ready to do a base setup. So what we can do is we can go to base setup, and you have 3 options. We have to do over known point, over last setup, or over any point. You do need to set the job and the coordinates if you're going to use a known point before you go to the base side of the equation. In this case, I'm going to assume a position, so I'll say over any point. I will key in my antenna height, so we'll say it's 4.95, and then you need to specify whether you have your base antenna set up on a pole or on a tripod or a pillar. So in this case, let's go ahead and select GS18 on a tripod, press OK, and this will set the vertical offset. This assumes that you're going to use a Leica base setup, which has a tribrac, a spacer, and a height hook to measure your height. So, and that's automatically adds in the distance between the height hook and the base of the antenna. So you want to make sure you have the right base antenna selected. Once you have that all set up, you press next, give a point, give a name to your base station. We'll just call it base. And then you'll press next and the unit will start broadcasting. I do want to make sure you have one note here. If you are using like a GS18, like a GS16 as your base station, you need to make sure that the external UHF radio antenna is attached. And once you're done with that, you're ready to switch to Rover and start your RTK survey. Thanks for listening.